2:30 in the afternoon on December 20th, 1943, at Jever Airfield in northern Germany, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler watched a crew chief dig frantically at the American point, 5.0 caliber bullet lodged deep in his Messerschmitt's radiator, while mentally counting the victories that separated him from the decoration he'd dreamed about since joining the Luftwaffe. 27 confirmed kills hung to his name, and the arithmetic of aerial warfare meant he needed just 3 more to reach 30 and guarantee himself the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. But bombers counted as 3 points, while fighters counted as 1. So, one more 4-engine bomber today would get him there immediately. The crew chief looked up from the damaged radiator with grease on his hands and warned Franz the engine would overheat if pushed hard. They're recommending he skip the rest of today's missions until proper repairs could be completed. Franz dismissed the concern because sitting on the ground meant watching opportunities fly past. And in this war, opportunities arrived disguised as crippled American bombers struggling home from raids on German cities. His father had flown reconnaissance over the Western Front during the First World War and survived 4 years of combat while earning decorations that young Franz studied as a child. And now, his own chance to match that legacy sat within reach if he could find one more damaged bomber limping toward England. A low drone of heavy engines pulled his attention skyward, and there against the winter clouds flew a B-17 at maybe 3,000 feet, trailing smoke from at least 2 engines. And that's exactly the kind of easy kill that would complete his tally and earn him a place among Germany's elite fighter aces. Franz climbed into his cockpit without waiting for tower clearance or final approval from the crew chief, who kept protesting about the radiator, firing up the Daimler-Benz engine that coughed once before, catching with a distinctive roar every Luftwaffe pilot knew meant speed and power. The Bf-109 left the runway within 90 seconds of spotting the bomber, climbing fast and turning to intercept the lumbering aircraft that hung in the sky like wounded prey, waiting for the Predator to finish what the flak guns had started. This would be simple, Franz told himself, while closing distance and positioning for the shot. Just a quick burst into the engines or cockpit, and the bomber would fall, and he'd return to base with his 30th victory confirmed, and the Knight's Cross guaranteed, and his father's legacy honored through his own achievement in Germany's Second War. Charles Brown from Weston, West Virginia, had grown up poor on a farm where survival meant dawn to dark work, and where flying airplanes seemed as distant as the moon. But the Army Air Forces gave him wings and training, and now command of a B-17F, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, carrying 9 other young men whose lives depended entirely on Charlie's ability to keep the shattered bomber airborne long enough to reach England. 21 years old, on December 20th, 1943, Charlie faced his first mission as aircraft commander, along with his crew's first combat mission together, and the 0600 hours briefing that morning warned them Bremen sat defended by more than 250 flak guns, plus swarms of German fighters that would tear apart the American bomber stream before it reached the Focke-Wulf factory designated as today's primary target. A Purple Heart corner meant the formation's edge position where German fighters concentrated attacks on the most vulnerable aircraft, and veterans knew stragglers and edge flyers couldn't benefit from the overlapping defensive fire that protected bombers in the center of the tight combat box. Co-pilot Spencer Pinky Luke sat to Charlie's right, adjusting throttles, while navigator Albert Doc Sadok crouched in the nose plotting their course, and bombardier Robert Andy Andrews prepared bombs for release over the target. And in the waist and tail positions, gunners scanned the sky for enemy fighters everyone knew would come screaming out of the sun once the formation crossed into German airspace. 27,300 feet put the outside air temperature at 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds and make defensive guns jam if crews didn't constantly work the actions. Flak burst directly in front of Ye Old Pub's nose at 11:30. And the shockwave shattered the plexiglass bombardier station while sending shrapnel through the number 2 engine and damaging number 4 badly enough that it started overspeeding whenever Charlie applied full power. 2 engines compromised. Before reaching the target meant the bomber immediately fell behind as speed dropped and altitude became harder to maintain. But Charlie pressed on because turning back now would leave them alone over Germany with 300 miles of hostile territory between their position and the North Sea. Bomb bay doors opened over Bremen, and Andy released all 12 500-pound bombs before calling bombs away. Oh, and Charlie immediately turned toward home while knowing the worst part still lay ahead, because German fighters always hit hardest when bombers left the target and separated from formation. 12 to 15 Bf-109s and FW-19Os swarmed Ye Old Pub within minutes of leaving Bremen, attacking in coordinated waves that hammered the damaged bomber with cannon fire and machine gun rounds that shredded hydraulic lines and electrical systems and the oxygen supply, keeping the crew conscious at altitude. Engine 3 took multiple hits and lost half its power. The rudder and port elevator got shot away, leaving Charlie fighting controls that responded only partially, and most of the 11 defensive guns froze solid in the extreme cold, leaving only the top turret and one nose gun operational. Tail gunner Hugh Ecke. Eckenrode never saw the 20mm cannon round that killed him instantly, and in the waist positions, both gunners took shrapnel wounds that left them barely conscious, while Pinky worked desperately to apply first aid to crew members bleeding out in sub-zero temperatures. Oxygen system failure at 22,000 feet meant both Charlie and Pinky lost consciousness within seconds as their brains starved for air. And with no one at the controls, Ye Old Pub rolled onto its side and entered a steep spiral that accelerated toward terminal velocity while the altimeter unwound through 20,000, 15,000, 10,000 feet. Charlie woke up somewhere around 10,000 feet, where the air contained enough oxygen to sustain life. And his first conscious thought involved the realization he was about to die as the bomber screamed downward with the airspeed indicator, showing speeds that would rip the wings off unless he did something immediately. Both pilots grabbed the yoke and pulled back with every ounce of strength their oxygen-deprived bodies could muster, and the bomber shuddered and somehow began leveling out at 3,000 feet over Oldenburg, so low that Charlie could see people on the ground looking up at the flying wreck passing overhead, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid and pieces of torn metal. Every working gauge showed readings that should have been impossible for an aircraft still airborne, with number 2 engine completely dead, number 3 producing maybe half power, number 4 threatening to shake itself apart. Hydraulics gone, and electrics failing, oxygen depleted, and only 2 guns out of 11 still capable of firing. The fuselage looked like someone had taken a giant can opener to it, with holes big enough to see completely through from one side to the other, and Charlie could see Pinky with blood on his face from a head wound and terror in his eyes that probably matched his own expression. The bomber shouldn't have been flying based on the damage sustained, but somehow the wings still generated lift and the remaining engines still produced thrust, and Charlie still had enough control authority to keep the nose pointed roughly north toward the coast and the North Sea and England beyond. Franz's Bf-109 climbed through 4,000 feet in pursuit of the damaged B-17 that represented his ticket to the Knight's Cross and recognition as one of Germany's elite aces, and he armed his guns while calculating the approach angle that would let him rake the bomber from tail to nose with 20mm cannons and machine guns. Catching the American bomber required almost no effort since it flew so low and so slow, and Franz pulled alongside at maybe 200 meters before beginning his attack run, but something made him hesitate and move closer instead of immediately opening fire. The tail gunner hung motionless over his guns with his head tilted at an angle that clearly indicated death. And as Franz flew even closer, he could see through the massive holes in the fuselage where German fighters had already done their work. Young American faces appeared in those holes. Boys really, 19 or 20 years old, frantically trying to save wounded crewmates while blood pooled on the floor and froze in sub-zero temperatures. One gunner attempted to bandage another gunner's leg wound with shaking hands that couldn't quite manage the task. And in the waist section, Franz could see a crew member slumped unconscious against the fuselage with his face pale and his flight suit torn where shrapnel had found flesh. Franz's finger rested on the trigger, and all he needed to do was apply 4 pounds of pressure to send cannon shells into the bomber's remaining engines and watch it fall from the sky, guaranteeing his 30th victory and the Knight's Cross that would follow within days. But here's the thing. Franz didn't fire because something his former commanding officer told him 2 years earlier in the North African desert suddenly filled his mind with the force of an order that could not be disobeyed. Gustav Rodel had been a fighter ace, and a leader who taught his pilots that honor mattered even in war, and Rodel's words echoed across the years with perfect clarity as Franz stared at the helpless American crew. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, Rodel had said, while they stood together under the merciless African sun after a mission where several Allied pilots had bailed out successfully. "I will shoot you myself, because we fight machines and not men. We celebrate victories and not death. And we know when it's time to answer a higher call." Franz looked at the B-17 crew again and realized they were no different than men floating defenseless in parachutes, because this bomber could barely fly and had no working guns that could threaten him and would almost certainly crash before reaching England, even if he turned away. Shooting them now would be murder rather than combat, execution rather than war, and Franz found he couldn't pull the trigger no matter how desperately he wanted the Knight's Cross that hung tantalizingly within reach. His brother August had died in a Junkers Jew 88 crash 3 years earlier when his bomber failed on takeoff in France. And Franz had grieved alone because August had been openly anti-Nazi and their parents had voted against Hitler's rise to power. What would August think if I killed these helpless boys? Franz thought while flying alongside the shattered B-17, and he knew his brother would condemn such an act as cowardice disguised as duty. Franz pulled his Bf-109 into position just 3 feet from the B-17's right wing, where pilot Charlie Brown could clearly see him through the cockpit glass, and Franz waved his hand trying to signal the American to land at a nearby German airfield, where the crew would become prisoners, but would receive medical treatment and survive rather than dying when their bomber inevitably crashed into the German countryside. Charlie stared at Franz with an expression combining terror and confusion in equal measure, clearly unable to understand why a German fighter pilot flew in formation with his bomber instead of shooting it down. Worst, and the American made no move to change course or acknowledge Franz's frantic gestures toward the ground. The bomber kept flying north toward the Atlantic Wall, where 250 flak guns waited to blast anything American out of the sky. And Franz realized the young pilot either didn't understand what Franz was trying to communicate or had decided to ignore the advice and attempt the impossible flight back to England. Franz knew what he had to do, even though the action would risk court-martial and execution if anyone in German command discovered what he was about to attempt. The B-17 headed straight for coastal flak batteries that would turn the crippled bomber into flaming wreckage the moment it came within range. So Franz moved his Bf-109 into tight formation on the bomber's port side, where German gunners on the ground would clearly see his fighter's distinctive silhouette and recognize it as one of their own aircraft. Flying this close to an enemy bomber broke every tactical doctrine because the American gunners could kill him with a single burst from their remaining operational guns. But Franz committed to the formation and held position as they approached the coast together like 2 aircraft belonging to the same unit rather than opposing forces locked in total war. If you want to see what happened when a German fighter ace gave up his chance at the Knight's Cross to save 9 Americans he was supposed to kill, hit subscribe right now, because this story gets even more insane and the ending will bring you to tears. Smash that like button, since this is the kind of story that needs to be told. Real heroism and real sacrifice instead of Hollywood garbage. Back to December 20th, 1943, when Franz Stigler made a choice that could get him executed. The battery commander on the Atlantic Wall lowered his binoculars after watching the strange pair approach from inland, and he shouted for his gun crews to hold fire because the Messerschmitt flying escort meant the B-17 must be a captured aircraft being used for training or reconnaissance rather than an enemy bomber attempting to escape. German forces operated several captured B-17 SS for studying American tactics and training their own crews on how to best attack flying fortress formations. So, seeing a Bf-109 shepherding a damaged B-17 toward the coast didn't immediately register as suspicious to flak gunners accustomed to following the lead of friendly fighters. Franz held his breath as they crossed over the gun emplacements and the beach obstacles, and then over the crashing surf of the North Sea, and only when they were several miles offshore over open water did he allow himself to believe they had actually made it past the deadliest concentration of anti-aircraft weapons in Europe without drawing a single shot. Charlie watched the German pilot with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion bordering on paranoia, all unable to comprehend why an enemy fighter would escort them to safety rather than finish what the other German fighters had started over Bremen. Co-pilot Pinky voiced what Charlie was thinking when he asked if the German was toying with them before shooting them down over water where there would be no witnesses and no one to confirm the kill. but Franz's actions suggested something entirely different from the predatory behavior they expected. The German pilot pulled his fighter even closer to Charlie's cockpit window and looked directly at the young American pilot with an intensity that transcended the barriers of language and nationality and war itself. Then Franz pointed east toward where Sweden lay across the water and mouthed the single word that Charlie couldn't hear but could clearly read on the German's lips. Sweden sat only 30 minutes of flying time from their current position and would offer sanctuary for the crew, along with medical treatment for the wounded and internment for the duration of the war, which beat dying in the North Sea, or attempting the 250-mile flight across open water to England with engines that could fail at any moment. Charlie considered the option for perhaps 5 seconds before dismissing it because his orders were to return to base, and landing in Sweden meant abandoning the mission and spending the rest of the war in comfortable captivity while his fellow airmen continued fighting and dying over Germany. The decision was probably insane, given the condition of Ye Old Pub and the crew and the engines. But Charlie shook his head at the German pilot and kept the bomber pointed northwest toward England and home. Franz tried one more time to convince Charlie to divert to Sweden by pointing more emphatically toward the east and shaking his head at the bomber's current heading, but the American pilot ignored him and maintained course toward what Franz believed would be certain death once the damaged engines finally quit, or the damaged airframe finally broke apart under stress. The German pilot had done everything he could to save these Americans, who by all rights should already be dead. And staying with them any longer meant risking interception by British fighters that patrolled the North Sea approaches and would shoot down any Luftwaffe aircraft they encountered, regardless of what that aircraft was doing. If Franz pulled his Bf-109 close to Charlie's cockpit one final time and locked eyes with the young American pilot across the 3 feet of air separating them, then Franz raised his hand in a crisp military salute that acknowledged the courage it took for Charlie to keep flying when any sane person would have landed or bailed out hours ago. Charlie watched Franz bank away toward the east and Germany and the war they were both fighting from opposite sides, disappearing into the winter haze like an apparition that might never have existed except for the fact that 9 American crew members had witnessed the impossible escort and could testify that a German fighter pilot had chosen mercy over victory. 250 miles of open water still lay between Ye Olde Pub's current position and the English coast. Yes, and every mile would test whether the remaining engines could continue producing thrust, and whether the damaged airframe could hold together, and whether Charlie's strength would last long enough to wrestle the barely controllable aircraft all the way home. Crew members took turns staying conscious to help Charlie monitor instruments and work the controls, and they talked to each other over the broken intercom to maintain morale and keep everyone focused on survival, rather than the very real possibility they would all die in the freezing North Sea within sight of England. RAF seething in Norfolk appeared through the clouds like a miracle Charlie had stopped believing would actually materialize, and he lined up for what would generously be called a crash landing, since the hydraulics controlling the landing gear and flaps had failed hours ago over Germany. The bomber hit the runway hard enough to collapse the damaged landing gear and send sparks shooting from the metal belly as Ye Old Pub skidded down the concrete before finally grinding to a stop in a cloud of smoke and hydraulic fluid and the distinctive smell of aviation fuel leaking from punctured tanks. Ground crews running toward the wreck expecting to find dead bodies, instead discovered 8 living crew members climbing out of the shattered fuselage plus 1 dead tail gunner who had given his life defending his friends during the fighter attacks over Germany, and maintenance personnel who began documenting the damage stopped counting bullet holes after finding more than 400 separate impacts that had turned the bomber into something resembling a cheese grater more than an aircraft. Charlie reported to his commanding officer during the post-flight debriefing that a German fighter pilot had escorted them out of German airspace and protected them from coastal flak guns, expecting perhaps a medal, or at minimum, some recognition that the crew had experienced something extraordinary during their first combat mission. The commanding officer's face turned red with anger as he listened to Charlie's account, and when Charlie finished, the officer leaned across the desk and told him in no uncertain terms that he was never to speak of this incident again to anyone, because the military could not allow positive sentiment toward enemy pilots to develop among American air crews who needed to maintain their fighting spirit and hatred of the Germans they were bombing every day. Someone in the chain of command had decided you couldn't be human and be flying in a German cockpit, which meant the story of Franz Stigler's mercy would be classified as secret and buried in files that wouldn't be opened for decades. Yet Franz landed his Bf-109 at Yavor Airfield with the radiator temperature gauge reading dangerously high from the bullet that remained lodged in the cooling system, and he taxied to his revetment without saying a word to anyone about what he had just done or why he had returned from a mission, without adding to his victory tally despite encountering a crippled bomber that represented an easy kill. The crew chief who had warned him about the overheating engine helped him out of the cockpit and asked if he had seen any action, and Franz responded with a vague comment about flying patrol over the coast, before changing the subject to the maintenance work needed on the fighter. Talking about what actually happened would guarantee court-martial for aiding the enemy, and possibly execution depending on how ruthless the presiding officers decided to be. So, Franz locked the memory away in a part of his mind where it couldn't accidentally slip out during casual conversation, or drinking sessions with fellow pilots. The Knight's Cross that had seemed so close that morning at breakfast now receded into the distance like a target Franz would never quite reach, and he found he had lost his appetite for hunting bombers with the same enthusiasm that had driven him to accumulate 27 victories over the previous 18 months. Franz continued flying combat missions and accumulating sorties until his total reached 487 flights over multiple theaters, including North Africa and Sicily, and the defense of Germany itself, getting shot down 17 times with 6 bailouts and 11 forced landings in damaged aircraft that somehow held together long enough to get him back on the ground alive. Victories stopped accumulating as Franz found other ways to contribute without necessarily pulling the trigger on helpless bombers limping home from their raids. And by war's end, he would be credited with 28 confirmed kills, rather than the 30 or more that might have earned him the decoration he had once coveted above all else. Germany surrendered in May 1945, and Franz walked toward American lines near Berchtesgaden with his logbooks tucked under his arm, as proof he was a pilot rather than SS personnel trying to disguise themselves as Luftwaffe to avoid summary execution. American interrogators confiscated his logbooks and promised to return them after processing, but Franz never saw those records again, which meant the detailed documentation of his 487 combat missions disappeared into some filing cabinet where they remained lost. 1953 brought Franz's emigration to Canada, where he settled in Vancouver and built a successful business career, and remarried and raised a family, and never spoke about the war except in the most general terms that avoided discussing specific missions or specific choices made while flying a Messerschmitt against Allied aircraft. Charlie completed his combat tour and returned to West Virginia before rejoining the Air Force in 1949 and serving until retirement in 1965, after which he settled in Miami and lived a quiet life that gave him plenty of time to think about the German pilot who had saved his life and his crew on that frozen December day in 1943. The memory haunted Charlie in the best possible way, and filling him with curiosity about who that pilot had been, and whether he had survived the war, and whether he ever thought about the 9 Americans he had escorted to safety instead of killing for a medal. 43 years passed with Charlie carrying the question, but having no way to find answers since the military had classified his report and forbidden him from discussing the incident. The Gathering of Eagles reunion in 1986 brought together combat pilots from multiple wars to share stories and remember friends who hadn't made it home. And someone in the audience asked Charlie if he had any particularly memorable missions during his time flying B-17s over Germany. Charlie thought for a moment, before deciding that enough time had passed and enough people had died, that his oath of silence no longer mattered. And so he told the story of December 20th, 1943, and the German fighter pilot who had escorted Ye Old Pub to safety instead of shooting it down for an easy victory. The room went completely silent as Charlie described the damaged bomber and the hopeless situation, and the Bf-109 that appeared alongside his wing, and the escort through the flak batteries and the salute before the German pilot disappeared into the winter sky. And when Charlie finished speaking, several people in the audience openly questioned whether the story was true. Charlie knew he hadn't imagined anything about that mission because the details remained etched in his memory with perfect clarity, And he decided at that reunion to spend whatever time and energy necessary to find the German pilot who had saved 9 American lives at the cost of his own advancement and possibly his own safety. 4 years of searching through Air Force records and German fighter pilot associations produced exactly nothing useful, and Charlie was beginning to accept that he might never know the identity of his anonymous savior when he decided to try one last avenue by writing a letter to Jägerblatt, a German magazine for former Luftwaffe pilots. The letter described the date and location and circumstances of the encounter, along with Charlie's plea for information about any German pilot who might have been involved in such an incident. Franz sat in his comfortable Vancouver home, reading the latest issue of Jägerblatt, when he turned to a page containing letters from readers and saw Charlie Brown's name and a description of an event Franz had buried in his memory for 47 years, and his hands started shaking so badly he had to put down the magazine and sit quietly for several minutes while processing what he had just read. The American pilot had survived. The bomber had made it back to England. And now, after nearly 5 decades, the pilot was searching for the German who had spared him and his crew from certain death. Franz picked up a pen and began writing a response that detailed every aspect of that December day, including the bullet in his radiator and his approach on the crippled bomber, and his decision not to fire, and the escort through the flak batteries and the final salute before breaking away toward Germany. Charlie received Franz's letter at his Miami address and immediately obtained Franz's phone number from directory assistants in Vancouver, and the phone conversation that followed reduced both men to tears as they confirmed details and shared perspectives and realized they had both been carrying this memory for nearly half a century. Franz described seeing the wounded crew through the holes in the fuselage, and remembering his commander's words about shooting men in parachutes, and thinking about his dead brother August, and making the choice to escort rather than kill, while Charlie described the terror of seeing the Bf-109 alongside his wing, and the confusion about what the German pilot wanted, and the gradual realization that this enemy was trying to save American lives. The conversation lasted more than an hour and ended with both men agreeing they needed to meet in person to properly acknowledge what had happened between them. June 21st, 1990, brought Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown together face-to-face for the first time since December 20th, 1943, meeting at a reunion of the 379th Bombardment Group in Massachusetts, where CBS News had set up cameras to film what everyone involved understood would be an extraordinary moment. Franz walked into the room where Charlie waited along with 2 other surviving crew members from Ye Old Pub, and the German pilot, who was now 74 years old, embraced the American pilot, who was now 67 years old, and both men cried openly while holding each other like brothers reunited after a long separation. The other B-17 survivors, Sam Blackie Blackford and Dick Peachout, may also embraced Franz while thanking him for giving them the opportunity to live full lives with wives and children and grandchildren who existed only because a German fighter pilot had chosen mercy over medals. Franz told them through tears that in 1940 he had lost his only brother August when his Junkers Ju-88 crashed on takeoff in France. And on December 20th, 1943, just 4 days before Christmas, he had been given the chance to save a B-17 from destruction, and had done so because he couldn't bear to kill more young men like his brother. Charlie Brown had become as precious to Franz as August had been, replacing the brother he had lost with a brother he had chosen to save. And the friendship that developed between Franz and Charlie over the next 18 years would prove more valuable than any Knight's Cross or military decoration either country could have awarded. The 2 men traveled across America together, speaking at air museums and civic clubs and military gatherings, telling their story to audiences who were invariably moved by the account of enemies who became brothers through an act of mercy that transcended the hatred and violence of total war. Franz wrote a note to Charlie that captured the essence of what both men believed about their encounter, saying he felt certain that some power greater than their respective governments had been looking out for them on December 20th, 1943, and had brought them together 4 decades later so they could find peace and healing in friendship. The note concluded with words Franz had written in a book he gave to Charlie, saying in 1940, "I lost my only brother as a night fighter on the 20th of December. 4 days before Christmas, I was able to save a B-17 from its destruction. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie, your brother Franz." The war had taken Franz's brother August and could have taken Charlie and his entire crew if Franz had made a different choice. But instead, the war gave Franz a new brother and gave both men a story of redemption that proved humanity could survive even the most inhumane circumstances. March 22, 2008 arrived, and Franz Stigler died peacefully at age 92 in his Canadian home, surrounded by family who had heard him speak with love and respect about Charlie Brown for the past 18 years. Yar and Franz went to his grave believing he had received something far more valuable than the Knight's Cross he had once pursued with such dedication. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown died at age 86 in Florida, following his friend and brother into whatever comes after this life, and the two pilots who had met as enemies and parted as brothers were reunited in death just as they had been reunited in life. The Swedish heavy metal band Sabaton released a song called No Bullets Fly in 2014 that told their story to millions who had never heard about the mercy shown over Germany in 1943. And author Adam Makos published a best-selling book titled A Higher Call in 2012 that documented every aspect of both men's lives and their extraordinary encounter and the friendship that followed. 2008 brought the surviving crew members of Ye Olde Pub their Silver Star Awards for actions during the Bremen mission, and Charlie Brown posthumously received the Air Force Cross, making him the only person ever to receive that decoration for being saved by an enemy pilot rather than defeating one. Franz Stigler received the German Star of Peace Award in recognition of his decision to spare American lives when he could have taken them, and a surviving B-17 bomber operated by the Erickson Aircraft Collection was repainted to look like Ye Olde Pub, and now flies at air shows across America as a living memorial to the crew who refused to give up, and the German pilot who refused to shoot them down. Franz's final words about Charlie before his death were simply that Charlie was his brother. And in that simple statement lay the entire meaning of what happened on December 20th, 1943, when two men met in the sky over Germany, and one of them chose humanity over glory. December 20th, 1943, 200 meters from a crippled B-17 bomber, finger on the trigger, Knight's Cross one burst of cannon fire away, and Franz Stigler faced a choice that would define the rest of his life and the lives of 9 American boys who would die if he did what every instinct and every training exercise and every propaganda poster told him was his duty: fight machines and not men. His commander had said 2 years earlier under the African sun, and Franz looked at those young faces frantically trying to save their wounded friends and realized these Americans weren't machines, but terrified boys who wanted to go home just as desperately as every German soldier wanted the war to end. The choice stood between glory and humanity, that between the Knight's Cross that would elevate him to elite status among German fighter pilots, and the mercy that would save 9 strangers whose names he didn't know, and whose faces he would remember for the rest of his life. Franz chose mercy and gave up his chance at the Knight's Cross, and risked court-martial and execution, and flew escort for an enemy bomber that should have been his 30th victory. And what he gained from that choice turned out to be worth infinitely more than any medal or decoration Nazi Germany could have provided. Charlie chose to search for the German pilot who saved his life, and spent 4 years writing letters and making phone calls until he found Franz Stigler living quietly in Vancouver. And what Charlie gained from that search was a brother and a friend, and a story that would inspire millions to believe humanity can survive even in the darkest circumstances. Both men chose to love their former enemy, and build a friendship that honored the mercy shown on that frozen December day. And both men died believing something greater than governments or military commands had brought them together and kept them alive so their story could become a testament to what people can choose when faced with the decision between doing what's expected and doing what's right. The higher call Franz answered wasn't the call to destroy enemy bombers or accumulate victories or earn decorations from a regime that would be utterly destroyed within 18 months. But rather the call of conscience that exists in every human being who ever faced a moment where they could choose between advancing themselves and honoring their values. December 20th, 1943, marked the day an enemy became family through one man's refusal to pull a trigger and another man's determination to find the person who spared him. And the legacy of that day lives on in the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, the German ace who gave up glory for mercy, and the American pilot who turned his savior into his brother, proving that even in total war between nations committed to each other's destruction, individuals can still choose humanity over hatred and friendship, over revenge and love, over everything that tells us to see enemies instead of people. Yeah, old pub made it home against impossible odds. Yet Franz Stigler answered a higher call than the one demanding he kill for medals, and two men, who should have died as enemies instead, lived as brothers, which is perhaps the greatest victory anyone could achieve in a war where victories were usually measured in death and destruction rather than mercy and friendship, and the kind of love that transcends nations and ideologies and everything that divides us when we choose to be divided.